Hello and welcome to the Actual Magicians. Yes, I am an Actual Magicians bookshelf, where today in the Actual Magician Explains we're going to be talking about timing in tarot. A lot of students ask, how do you tell when something is going to happen? Precisely when something is going to happen. And whilst I don't say that I can do this precisely, I do have a rule and a method for timing. And I'm going to demonstrate it with the Thoth Tarot, but this is a method that also works with any deck that has numbered Minor Arcana, which is most tarot decks. So anything with a deck running Ace to 10 in 4 suits, a standard tarot deck, so a Tarot de Marseille, a Thoth deck, a Waite-Smith deck, or any other variant will work with this particular method. And we can have a look at, say, for example, the court cards and see that this would be something happening in spring, this would be something happening in the summer, this would be something that would be happening in the autumn, the Queen of Cups, and then finally something happening in the winter with the Knight of Discs, which is the King of Pentacles or the King of Coins in any other deck, but a Golden Dawn deck or a Thoth deck which uses the Knight as the King and the Prince as the Knight. So if you want to know anything more about the Thoth deck, I have written a trilogy of books in this series, Secrets of the Thoth Tarot, where the first one looks at the overall nature of the deck and the history, and it's based on Crowley's own writings and his tarot readings throughout his journals and diaries. He didn't read with a Thoth deck, of course, because it was never printed in his lifetime. And then the next one is the Minor Arcana with Geomancy and the I Ching, which Crowley used for some of the correspondences. And then finally, the court cards and actual reading methods, and I give the few examples that Crowley did give when he actually did readings himself. So that's a trilogy called Secrets of the Thoth Tarot, and it's available on Amazon. It doesn't have the illustrations in because I wasn't given permission by the OTO, who owned the copyright on the actual cards, but as long as you've got a deck, then this is perhaps a useful guide for you. So very simply, in court cards appearing within a deck, we can have those corresponded to as winter for the Knight, as autumn for the Queen, as summer for the Prince or Knight as it is in other decks, and spring for the Princess. And I tend to do that from a more Kabbalistic basis, even though these cards do have zodiacal correspondences, which obviously go to timing as well, but that's just my particular method of doing it. And if you have a background in astrology and understand the astrological correspondences, then you can do it from that as well. A deck will always speak to you in the language that you know. It won't make things up because it's a oracular moment between you and the deck itself. So therefore, as we say in Tarosophy, the oracular moment is sacrosanct, and there is only that moment that will dictate exactly whether you use your rules, use your knowledge, use your intuition, or almost channel something from the divine nature itself. And we can do the same with the major arcana. Again, some of these have zodiacal correspondences, so you can use timing from that. But that's not the rule I'm going to show you today. I'm going to show you a more fixed rule that I put across on Instagram recently, but then the text description was yay long. And it's a very simple rule. You can do it in your head in real time. It only requires a very, very basic knowledge of adding things up. But it's a lot easier to explain by video and by demonstration or in a class or in a course. So that's why I'm doing this video, so I can explain it a little bit better. Now, with major arcana, I tend to use these in a reading if I'm talking about timing a bit more abstractly. So the Fool will tell me that I'm not going to be able to tell the timing because the Fool is pure freedom, pure dissolution, and doesn't hold to any rules at all. So if this was the only major card in a reading, a 3-card reading, a 5-card reading, even a 10 or 15 card reading, then I would probably be talking about the non-importance of the timing itself. And I quite often think this about reading tarot anyway, that fixing it to a fixed time point is a little bit narrowing in terms of the possibilities, the options, the freedom I want to give a client to be able to chart their own course towards the best possible outcome. And sometimes that best possible outcome is responding to things as they then happen. And because of the reading itself is going to direct that, that will abrogate any particular timing issue that we might want to build into the reading. So the star would be a long time. So again, short time, medium time, long time. The star would indicate long time. The sun 1 year because of the solar calendar. The moon would be 1 month because of the lunar rotation. Something like the Hanged Man would be, it's not going to get sorted out until you do some particular action to stop the suspension of this. Otherwise, the status quo will hold, and therefore it's more in your hands. Certainly with the Aeon, something like that, then there is a pregnant pause ready for the event, but when it does happen, it's going to be life-changing because this is the Aeon, or the Last Judgment, as it would be in a Waite-Smith type deck. And the Hermit, maybe one could say it's a demonstration of the astrological correspondences, that this is corresponding to Virgo, therefore it would be August to September, mid-August to mid-September, when the sun enters Virgo every year. And we could give a timing from that. And so on and so forth. With the major arcana, because they are images of archetypal nature, then their timing can be brought down into all sorts of different correspondence systems or application. So the rule I'm going to give you is based on Kabbalah, and it uses the minor cards only, so the minor cards that are in a reading. And for this we need perhaps a little bit of background in Kabbalah, but you don't have to know this. So if you want to skip ahead to the next chapter, I'll give you the method directly. But first, because I like to teach this stuff and give the reasons why I use it and why I find it useful in practice to do timing with tarot in this way, it is based on Kabbalah. So I'd like to give you a brief overview of how that works, and it might help you understand the method as well. And in a previous video, of course, we made a tree of life, and we talked about correspondence, and we talked about Kesheth, the rainbow, and the letters and so forth. And it looks awfully complicated, perhaps, but what we're going to do today is draw ourselves a new tree, a more simple tree, and I'll just quickly draw the Sephiroth, which means numerical emanation. And so I'll draw those down in a tree of life pattern, as we can see. And for this, we only need the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. And it doesn't matter their particular placement here, because we're talking about a straight sequence of numbers. I could just draw this down 1, 2, 3. In fact, let's do that down here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'll draw those as a Sephirothic chain, like so. Now, the Tree of Life purports to be a model of existence and a model of the creative force coming down or manifesting in the universe from total unity of all things all the way down through the Sephiroth into where we perceive it, which is in Yesod here. So this is where we sort of live in terms of our sensory perceptions. We make the world, which is in effect 1 plus 0, back to the 1 at the top, and this one is the same as that one because they're all one thing. But we live in different states of differentiation, experiencing the universe through awareness, which is in the center here, which is why the 6s in the Minor Arcana are far more balanced and central than the 5s, because that's not the halfway point geographically in the layout. The 6 is the halfway point, and 5 is actually more challenging and more troublesome because it represents Kabbalah on the tree of life. But we don't need to know any of that. We just need to know that if something is up here, it has got a long way down to go to manifest, whereas if something is about here, then it's almost manifest. It's almost manifest in the map. So if something is here, a 6, then it's almost halfway, or it is literally halfway, and it just has to go through a few more stages before it arises in the world of action, which is where we live down here. We actually live in this area here. And so if a Minor Arcana card is down here, a 10, whether it be a 10 of discs or pentacles or coins, or a 10 of blades or knives or swords, or a 10 of batons or wands, or a 10 of cups or chalices or grails, then it's already manifest, it's already here. So the time that it's going to happen in is literally now or very, very soon. It's in our manifest world. It's actually already arising, likely. Whereas a 1 is a long way away from where we are now, so it's going to take a long time to get all the way down. And so you can see how this might work with timings. If the cards are somewhere up here, then it's still got a long way to come, and so it's a further time away. And if the cards are all down here, then it's got a shorter way to come, and therefore it's got less time before it actually happens. It's going to happen sooner with cards down here and later with cards up here. So the 1s, 2s and 3s mean that the event is far, far away, and the 8s, 7s, 8s, 9s and 10s mean that it is a lot closer. It's going to happen a lot closer. So how can we use this for actual timings? Now, I played around with a lot of ways of doing it in the last 35, 40 years that I've been reading tarot, face-to-face, in car boot sales, at psychic fairs, at all sorts of events. So I know that this works in real time because this is why I use it and not any of the other methods that I've tried. And so what we have to do is we look at the minor cards in the spread. So let me take just randomly a few cards out of the minors. So this is only the Minor Arcana of the Thoth deck. As I say, this will work with any deck. For example's sake, and I did shuffle these, but all of the 8s and 9s do appear to have been shuffled together, which is interesting. So let me choose these more deliberately just as an example. So if we had these 3 cards, the 8 of wands, which is swiftness. Oops, let me put these up. The 9, this is the 9 of cups, but again, we don't need to worry about the suits for this method. You can come up with a variation of this with the suits, but for the sake of this, we're not going to look into that. We just need to do it with the numbers. So we have basically 8, 9, and 8. Now, if those were the only 3 minor cards in a reading, whether it was a 3-card reading and these were the 3 cards, or whether it was a 5-card reading or a 10-card reading like a Celtic Cross, or a 15-card reading, which is the one I tend to do with the Thoth, 3, 3, 3, 3, and 3 sort of arrangement, then if these were the only minor cards and someone said, roughly when is it going to happen, do you think? That would be somewhat sooner, because we've got an 8, a 9 and an 8. So we know on our Tree of Life diagram that these cards are already down here. So that means it's going to happen sooner rather than later. It's an almost immediate thing that is going to happen, because the cards are already showing us that the forces involved in the reading are sooner, 8, 9 and 8, than later. Now, if you want to try and make it a little bit more accurate, the first step to do is get an idea from the client, or from yourself if you're doing a reading for yourself, as to the time scale. We need an actual time scale in which this thing may or may not happen. That could be a week, it could be 3 months, it could be any time within the next year, or by summer, or by winter next year. And we ask the client when they're starting, or when they could expect the first result to happen for this particular thing that they're asking about, and roughly when they would lose hope in it happening, or when it would not be possible, or by when that they have to make a decision or change their mind about something. Like, for example, if it was about a romance and finding a new romance, and we'd done the rest of the reading and they wanted to know a bit more about timing, if they were going to a social meeting or gathering or party or bar or something like that that night, then the soonest that the event might happen with meeting somebody new in their life would be that evening. But then you could say, if you go about the things we've talked about in the reading for the next 3 months, and then you're probably going to look at changing your approach, or changing what you're doing, or maybe moving, or changing job. Maybe there's another significant event that would change the time scale of what you're doing looking for a new romance. So it's at any time between now and 3 months' time. And when I do a Celtic Cross or a standard reading for somebody, I usually at least set the time scale of my reading for 3 months. I think that's a fair enough time, again, over practice, that I've found the accuracy, relevancy and immediacy of a reading, the effectiveness of it, works best for my clients and for myself. Because if you set it too long, it becomes too vague and amorphous, and it's no use in 9 months' time suddenly thinking, oh, that's what that tarot reading was about, being surprised by it, because then the tarot reading would have been no service or use to you. And if it's like, will this happen tonight because I've got a court case happening this afternoon, then that is way too immediate. And I never do immediate tarot readings for people. If they email me and say, I need a reading today, then I don't like to do a tarot reading unless there's a particular oracular moment when it feels right to do so. Because, again, the usefulness of the reading has been constrained by the question and the time itself. So, if it was, for example, someone saying, I'm looking for a new relationship, I've just started a new course of study and that's going to last a year, then I would think about the timing in terms of a year, because their overall timing and situation that I'm doing the reading with is not going to change, likely, unless the reading says it might, over a whole year. So then I know that the time period is a year. And this can be as direct, defined, vague, amorphous, anytime soon, anytime later. And then you can answer, well, it will be sooner rather than later, or it'll be about in the middle of those two things, or it will be later rather than sooner. You can always work with what the client gives you with this method. So when we've established our time frame, we then, in our heads, have that in our heads. So we apply it to the whole of the 1 to 10. So let's talk about a year then. So 1 would be obviously sooner in the year, and 10 would be later in the year. So we're sort of looking at roughly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, sort of 12 months. And I've not done these quite like for like, but we're going to do that mathematically in a second. So if I got a load of sixes in the reading, a load of fives or sixes in the reading, that would be roughly halfway through the month, which is 6 months. So I'd be able to tell them, if you're looking for a timing, then this is roughly going to be about 6 months, halfway through the year, because most of my cards are at the halfway point. If it was a 1, like I only had an ace in the reading, then I'd actually be looking at it's going to take the entire year, because it's got to get down all the way from that ace into manifestation. So that's going to take the entire year. So in effect, what we're doing is we're pivoting there and we're swapping those around. So the time period, even though it runs sequentially, in our heads, we just have to take it off and minus it from the time period. Now, that might sound a bit complicated, but it's the only thing that you need to remember about this. And you can just do it roughly. That's fine. If it's a 1, 2, or 3, then it's going to be taking a long part of the whole year. Or if it's a 8, 6, then as we've seen, it's going to be about halfway. It's still got to come halfway down, so that's going to be halfway in the year. And if it's a 9, we've got a couple of 9s or a couple of 8s and a 9, as we saw, then it's almost happening, so it's going to be sooner in the year, because that 9 is almost manifesting. Now, the simple maths to do this is averages. If you want to be even more accurate, then we need to use some averages. And this is sort of what I do in my head, and it's always fairly simple. As long as you can add up a few numbers and divide them roughly by 2, 3, or 4, 5 maybe, then you'll be fine with this method. So if you're allergic to maths, I don't blame you, then you can switch off at this point. That is just the rough method. If it's early numbers, then it's going to take a while through the time period. And if it's middle numbers, it'll be halfway through the time period. So if it was literally 3 months that they'd said was their rough time period, and they got some 6s and 5s and 7s in the reading in the middle, then halfway through 3 months is 1.5 months, which is 6 weeks. So that would give you a timing in about 6 weeks, halfway through the period, because I've got halfway cards. If I've got early cards, it's going to happen towards the end of the 3 months. If I've got later cards, it's going to happen sooner in the 3 months, within the next month, so sooner than they think, perhaps, because they've got the later cards. Okay, so that's the general rule. Now, again, for those of you who want to do a little bit of maths in your head during a tarot reading, it's as simple as this. We take the average. We take the average of any minor cards, we add them all up, divide them by the number of cards, and that will give us a number always between 1 and 10. And that gives us the percentage, or the stage from 1 to 10, that the whole reading is manifesting down the tree of life. Pretty simple, huh? And once we've got that, then we, in effect, take that away from the scale, because we know it's got that far so far, like to the 6, so we know that it's still got 4 to come, and because it's a scale of 1 to 10, and so it's 40% in the time scale. Let's do a few examples, and this is why I wanted to do a video of this, to show you how relatively easy it is. And I'm going to do this roughly in my head. You can use a calculator if you want, if you're doing it for yourself and you have the time and you don't mind doing it with a calculator, that's perfectly fine. So let's just practice some averages then. So let's take a 1 and a 5 here. Yeah, let's take a 1 and a 5. And again, I'm not worried about the suits for this. We will have already done the reading, usually by this point. So we are just looking at the numbers of the cards. So we have a 1 and a 5, an ace of discs in this case, and a 5 of swords, which doesn't necessarily bode well for the whole reading if these were the only 2 cards that we had in it, or 2 minor cards in it, depending on the other cards and the question, obviously. So we have the 1 and the 5. So let's assume this was in a 5-card reading, a 10-card reading. It doesn't actually matter what we assume. We're just looking at the minor cards in the reading. And we're then just looking at the numbers. We just have 2 numbers, a 1 and a 5. So to do an average, we add them up and divide by the number of numbers that we've got, or the number of cards, literally, that we've got. So again, this may seem obvious if you're reasonably familiar with averages, but I'll do it longhand so that we've got a basis for the next one. So we have a 1 and a 5, which equals 6. So we just add them up in our head. 1 and 5 make 6. We've got 2 cards. So we divide the 6 by 2, and that gives us 3. The average of 1 and 5 is 3. And mentally we can roughly work that out, that roughly halfway between 1 and 5 is 2.5, but that's roughly 3 if we're rounding up in this particular case. So we've got 3. It's about, if we've got a 1 and a 5, we can see it's roughly going to be at the early stages of something. So the 3 is here. Now that means it's got 7 to go before it hits the bottom. So what we now do is we take that off 10 in order to, in effect, flip it. It's not 3 immediate, it's 3 in the system, so it's still got 7 to go. So we then take it off 10, that gives us 7. Take it off 10, that gives us 7. And you can do this in your head really quickly at a table. It only takes a few seconds to do it in your head. Perhaps practice for yourself if you're not that confident. And that means it's still got 7 to go, in effect, 7 to go in the time period that you're given. So it's got to the 3 stage of it, but it's still got 7 to go. So the 7 of this time period, if it was a year, would be roughly about 7. So let's say it's about 8-ish. So it's roughly 70% of the way down to 12. Again, you can do this with a calculator if you want to be exact. But in my head, I'd roughly say it's going to be 8 months from now. 8 months from now. And again, it might seem a bit convoluted, but like many things, particularly maths things, it's a lot easier to do once you do it than it is necessarily to explain. And I'm not a maths teacher, so I'm trying to explain this hopefully in the simplest way without overcomplicating it. So let's take a look at that. Now we've looked at the actual method with a few worked examples. So in each of these cases, let's take a period of 10 months, okay? So if they said, well, about a year, but it might not be an entire year, so let's just assume for the sake of our maths, 10 months. We'll do a few examples with that, and then we'll look at a few 3-month examples or something like that, 3-year examples even. Because once we have the method, we can do it fairly straightforwardly. So let's take a look at, again, 3 cards. So we've got these 3 minor cards. And again, we don't worry about the suits at the moment for this. We've got a 5, a 5, and a 10. So again, roughly in my head, I'm going to add those up. So we've got 10 plus 5 plus 5, so that's 20. We've got 3 cards, and that's roughly 7. If we divide 20 by 3, in my head, I make up the 20 to 21-ish, and divide that by 3, which I know is 7, because 3 sevens make 21. So it's roughly 7-ish. And I double check that in my head by looking at the cards and say, would 7 be roughly, if I smoosh these cards together and try to get the median for them or the average for them? And I think that's about right. 5, I've got a couple of 5s pulling that way and a 10 about here. So 7 is going to be their average. 10 plus 5 plus 5. Oops. So that's 20, roughly 21, say, so we can divide it by the 3 cards. That's 7. So 7 then means that it's fairly well manifest. It's 70% of the way down the tree into manifestation. And we can tell that because these are virtually halfway and this is virtually finished. And in the material world, it's really present. It's almost immediate. This is the 10. It's the bottom of everything, the tree of life. So the 5s are holding it back a little bit towards the 7 stage, but that's roughly where it is. So that means that it's still got 3 to go. So taking off the 7 out of 10, it's still got 3 to go. So it's manifest down to the 7-ish stage. It's got 3 more to go. So that means that if it's a period of 10 months, that's roughly 3 out of the 10. So that's 3 months' time. 3 months' time. And that's roughly how I'd say it. So if they said, well, it's a period of 10 months and we had these minor cards, I go, well, it's actually going to happen sooner rather than later and probably within the next 3 months, which is quite convenient if I'm doing them a reading every 3 months, because it's likely to happen before they have their next reading if they're going to have another reading in about 3 to 6 months. And that's how I do it. So let's take a look at another simple method. Just put those cards down there. And again, this will depend on whether you're using or considering the major cards in the reading. If you have a lot of cards like the Blasted Tower and some princesses in the Thoth deck, it's all very immediate energy, so that might override the time scale depending on how you want to work that. But it would usually support the time scale, to be honest. You'd usually find a lot of later cards like 7s, 8s and 9s with all of that immediate energy because the whole reading is resonating to that person's situation. So the court cards and any timing you might do with the zodiacal or astrological correspondences, the major cards and their correspondences to timing, and the minor cards, they'll all make a full set of timing for you. So another 3 cards. We've got a 4, a 7 and an ace, so that's 8, 12 in total, so or 7 plus 4 is 11, plus 1 is 12, divided by 3 is 4, so it's 40% of the way down, so it's still got 60%, so that's just a little bit over half, just a little bit over half of the time. So in this case, looking at those, if it was a 3-year reading, I'd say, well, it's going to take over a year and a half before this actually comes to pass. And then I mentally check it and see that, yep, it is likely to be over a year and a half because we've got 2 quite early cards that have still got a way to go yet and a little bit of a later card, but it's not all the way down at the 8, 9 or 10 yet, so it's not pulling these 2 down too far. So in effect, yeah, I'd say roughly just over a year and a half in a 3-year period, or if this was a question for 3 months away, then it would be a month and a half again, just over a month and a half, maybe 8 weeks if I wanted to be precise, or I could get out a calculator and do the exact point in that scale. So let's take another example, and I'm going to give you 2 cards and we're going to practice together. So let's do this. So the first thing to think is this going to happen sooner or later? Is this almost manifest or not quite manifest yet? Whereabouts is it roughly on the tree? Okay, so if you're with me, then This card is just over halfway. This card is way further down to the 8. So it's more sooner than later. More sooner than later because both of these cards have passed their halfway point already. They're almost manifesting. The 6 is only got 4 to go. The 8 has only got 2 to go. So they're almost manifest. So let's take that through our method then. So what do we do first? We add them up. So if you want to add them up in your head. So that's 14. 8 plus 6 is 14. Now, how many do we need to divide that by to get an average? How many numbers or cards have we got? That's 2. So 8 plus 6 is 14. Divided by 2 is 7. So the average of these two cards is 7, and we can tell that because 6, 7, and 8 is literally in the middle of the two of them. It's 7, so it is 7 of the way down, and that means it's only got 3 of the way to go. So quite sooner rather than later. A 30%, 3 out of 10, out of whatever time period we're talking about. So if it was 9 weeks, then 30% of that would be 3 weeks. So it's going to happen in the next 3 weeks would be the answer. So it's going to happen sooner rather than later within the first third of time, because these two cards are literally 7 out of 10 down their journey. They've still got 3 to go. And so that's going to be sooner rather than later. So let's do another one with 3 cards. And again, it doesn't matter what order or position they appear in the reading, unless that gives you some oracular insight into timing. But the rule is still the same. So here we have so if you've done it in your head, that's simply 10 plus 4 plus 2. It's 16, or 4 plus 2 plus 10, 2 plus 4 plus 10. It doesn't matter which order you do it in your head. In my head, I see the 10, I see the 4 and the 2. I add the 4 and 2 together, makes 6. Add it to the 10, that makes 16. And then we're going to divide it by 3 cards. So 16 divided by 3 is 5 and a bit, because I know that 15 divided by 3 is 5, so it's going to be 5 and a bit. So it's roughly 5 and a bit down. That means it's got, say if we round it up to 6, it's still got 40% left to go. So again, sooner rather than later, but roughly in the middle. When we look at those cards, we can see that the 10 is dragging the average down for the 4 and the 2. So this is the culprit actually bringing it into reality a lot sooner than these two would just by themselves. If it was just those 2 cards, then it's 4 plus 2 is 6, divided by 2 is 3, so that means it's got 7 to go, 7 to go yet. So 70% of the way of the time period. So again, if that was a year, say again 10 months, that would be at least 8 months in before it was going to manifest according to those 2 cards. Okay, shall we do one more example? And then I'll leave you to your calculators. Here we go. So let's take that one, this one. Let's do 4 cards, shall we? Can we do 4 cards? I think we can. Let's do that. I'm sort of picking these at random. I'm not picking them for any particular mathematical ease, because you never know what cards you're going to get. So we've got 4 cards, and I'll give you a bit of time to do it in your head and to work out each stage at a time. So again, let's take a simple time period of, let's do 10 years. Let's do 10 years. I don't know why anyone would ask a question that might happen within the next 10 years, but let's say 10 years is the strange question we've been asked. We can still do it with timing. So, what's the first thing we do? Well, just take a look at it quickly And is that going to happen sooner in the 10 years or later in the 10 years? And I'm thinking sort of in the middle-ish, because we've got a 10 and an 8 that are towards the bottom and a 3 and a 4 that are equally towards the top. So that seems to me quite a middling thing in our time scale. So I'd say about 5 years, 6 years. And I'd say to the person, well, it's not going to happen soon. It's not going to happen a long time away. It is going to happen roughly in the middle. And this is the thing with timing, that sometimes it's not necessarily useful to know the timing. But if someone has asked about it, this is my rule of thumb and rule of law that I use to do it. So roughly in the middle, I'd say. But let's do it for real. So if we add these up, we get 25. I did that in my head by adding the 10 plus the 8 to make 18. 22 by adding the 4, and 25 by adding the 3. So it's roughly 25. And then we're going to divide that by 4. So we get, and I do this on my fingers, so we divide 25 by 4. Well, we go 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. So that's 6. To roughly get 25, so 6. So this indeed, the average is roughly about 6, and that means it's 60% of the way down. It's got 40% left to go. So in our 10-year period, that would be 4 years or a little bit more, just over 4 years. So I would give an average of roughly 4 years out of the 10. That seems to make sense from just looking at them and just gauging it roughly. So it doesn't matter what time period you're asked, how many cards you've got, how many minor cards you've got in the reading, you can always calculate out a rule for roughly how long something will take. And it only takes a bit of practice. Do it for yourself. If you do it for yourself, you can test it as well. You can accurately do it for the calculation itself. Use a calculator on your phone and work it out precisely, and then calibrate it by the actual result. So if you do it for things where you can test the time for it and do it over time, then you might find that your method particularly changes. There would be no problem whatsoever with you using a method by which you didn't take the average off the 10. Out of the 10 afterwards, that you just said, right, okay, so the average is 3, and therefore it's going to happen in the space of a third out of the time scale, not a 10th, taking it out of the 10 to make a 7th. Because the thing is that the cards will always speak the language that you're speaking. They will always speak to you in the language that you expect, that you know, that you practice and are using. Sometimes it might vary and keep varying it until you learn the language that they're speaking. And that can happen with different decks, for example. But if you do it a particular way, then the cards will correspond and map that particular way. And that's why there is really no right or wrong way of doing a tarot reading, but there is a way that is true to the way you do it. You mustn't break your own rules inside your head, because then you can allow bias, expectation, all sorts of things, even guesswork to creep in if you don't hold to your own rules while you're doing it. But if you see a rule being broken in your expectations and you're saying, well, usually I would read this as this, but in this case, I'm going to read it like this because of it fits the reading better, or it fits the oracular moment, your intuition, something else about the cards, then that is also perfectly fine to do, because over time, you'll start reading it the way you have said, oh, this is a surprise. I think I'm going to have to break my own rule with the way I'm reading this, because the cards will have taught you and calibrated you to a better way of corresponding the cards to reality. It is a language that you are using between you and the cards. So whatever you expect, the cards will respond to, because you're the one doing the tarot reading. You are a tarot card reader, and the cards will always respond to that. So shall we do one final one before we go? And I'll take 3 cards again, because usually in a 10 card reading there's going to be at least 2, 3, maybe 4 minor arcana, just statistically, depending on the reading and the question. But let's take a look at this. We've got a 5, a 2 and a 3. So I'd add up the 3 and the 2 to make a 5, add that to the 5, that makes a 10, divided by 3, that's roughly, I know 3 3s are 9, so that's roughly 3 and a bit, because it's out of 10. That means it's got about 7 left to go. So about 70% of the time of the time period that the person's given me. And that's how quick it is to do. You just do it in your head. And so, and I can mentally check that by looking at that and saying, well, these are hardly down the tree of life at all. This one's only halfway down the tree of life, less than that really. And so it's going to be roughly a sort of 70% of time still to go. I can well imagine that. Okay, I hope that makes sense. And you can do it just roughly, and you can do it mathematically. But for me, I just like to have a rule I can follow and that works for me if someone asks me about timing. I hope that's been useful for doing timing in tarot. Of course, that method will work for Tarot de Marseille. It will work for the Thoth. It will work for the Waite Smith. It will work for fully scenic illustrated cards and pip cards, because you're just using the basic numbers in the cards themselves. It will even work with playing cards and cartomancy. So thank you for listening along. I hope that might be useful to you, or at least provoke you into thinking about your own way of doing timing in tarot for what works for you. I look forward to seeing you in another Actual Magicians Explainer video. And until then, as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop.